thanks for being here today with Dan and myself. If you're looking at the screen, you'll probably notice we've already hit our first technical issue and that the eyes aren't working on the font. So we're all smart people though, so hopefully we can imagine kind of that that's actually saying kill the competition, not yourself. So today we're going to be talking to you about kind of well-being and well-being in the context of sort of startups and especially sort of founders and entrepreneurs. So when we're saying founders today, we're not just meaning that the founders and that sort of rarefied air, but we're talking about kind of people with that entrepreneurial mindset and why it's important to sort of look after their own well-being, sort of as well as their business and the different employees and the teams that they look after. A lot of the work that we do tends to be in this sort of employee space as well, and building sort of EVPs and making sure that brands and organizations are getting the best out of their people. But how do we make sure that we also get the best and make sure that our leaders and founders are operating at their best too? So just to introduce ourselves, my name's Gareth. I'm a senior strategist at Principles. So we're a brand consultancy and agency. So we work across kind of all areas of strategy, identity, experience, digital. We do sort of research and insights as well. So that's the team that I sit in. Also on the call today is Dan Bradley, who's our director of Alpha Lab, which is our sort of innovation and experience kind of specialist arm as well, that we run too. So Dan will sort of chip in later on. I guess I forgot to do this the last time we did one of these. So if you want to reach out to us at all, feel free to look us up on LinkedIn and I don't know, connect, look us up on Google, whatever that usual sort of stuff is. So I guess, again, just in terms of getting out of our leaders what we want to get out. So, we're seeing that founders were kind of assuming that, sacrificing their health is the only route to success, but we want to sort of design a better way. So a lot of this kind of is trying to combat this sort of, this hustle and grind sort of culture and mentality that people think that they're being forced into. So how do we put the things in place to make sure that, people aren't burning out and again, that everyone's always performing at their best. So just to paint a little bit of context around this as well is that we're finding that startup founders and entrepreneurs especially are sort of over-indexing when it comes to, battling kind of issues around well-being, whether that be through, having reporting histories of depression, reporting, the symptoms of ADHD, kind of falling into substance abuse and people having sort of bipolar diagnoses. So again, all bad things that we need to try and help sort of overcome. So I guess what we'll do today is hopefully get to a few recommendations, again, that sort of Dan will talk to kind of in the second half of this presentation about the things and the behavior changes that we can sort of try and promote anyway to try and overcome these issues around kind of valuing well-being, having a greater sort of value mindset, placing value on your team and valuing the everyday as well. So just in terms of context and I guess what are the drivers of us sort of making these recommendations around well-being. So we've been doing some recent work, both Dan and myself together, sort of around startup communities and startup ecosystems. So I think we just wanted to sort of play back first some of the things that we've heard in terms of what are the front of mind perceptions and things that sort of frame the industry and again, kind of why well-being is so valued. So again, we know that there's this massive sort of startup opportunity, not just in terms of, the individual and them kind of having their success, but we know that this is a kind of economic wide kind of opportunity as well, just in terms of the jobs that they can create, the growth that they can contribute. But we know, again, all this stuff doesn't happen unless there are the founders there and that are performing well to be able to create those jobs to, drive this innovation and to help kind of make these sort of changes. From a sort of social business perspective, I guess people were picking up and obviously there's sort of been increased reporting and the sort of lack of moral leadership in the business world. So this idea that people think it's bad to be in business, that nice guys finish last. So, not just startups, but the kind of business community in general has had this kind of erosion of trust that's started to happen. So again, that's something that, founders and entrepreneurs are trying to respond to on top of, creating and building their businesses. And then likewise, we've seen, and we've heard about this increased sort of reporting around, techlash and responsibility, that, there's this kind of fear of the unknown. I'm not sure a lot of you people probably have seen on the call, have seen, the social dilemma on Netflix and those sorts of things. We hear all these stories about, data breaches and Facebook. You hear the bad news stories about, places like WeWork and those sorts of things. So again, these are all things that are just sort of painting the context around, how people are thinking and behaving towards, startups and building companies. And then I guess on top of that as well is the kind of personal side of things where, entrepreneurial well-being tends to take a backseat. And I suppose that's especially kind of prevalent in more modern kind of businesses as well, where founders tend to be so tightly linked to their companies, and that their personas and personalities become one and the same. It's hard to sort of divorce yourself from the business. So you've seen that kind of in more recent times with, people like Elon Musk or Mark Zuckerberg, that kind of become the embodiment of the brand as well. So it's sort of overtaking their personal lives too. You see that kind of in terms of Australian startups with, Mel Perkins and Canva and Scott and Mike and Atlassian almost, being the face of that brand as well. So they've got to sort of behave and work on those two levels. So all this really does is just, it all ladders up, and all these external pressures just build up to this idea of underperformance. So the fact that, the performance of these businesses, there's the potential anyway to be compromised by not sort of prioritizing and looking after well-being. So, in any competitive landscape, whether it's in business or sports, you always want to be able to perform at your best, and you need to sort of give yourself the tools and the latitude to look after yourself to make sure that you can do those things. And it is a rampant problem. So again, just some examples here from this CEO coach, Matt Munson, who spends his time sort of coaching, leaders as well. As a lot of it becomes like a bad relationship. You sort of found this company to do great things and innovate, but it's all the kind of peripheral things and pressures that build up and sort of cause things like burnout and those kind of well-being issues. So, some of the examples of the cries for help that he's heard is, people that have raised millions of dollars but want to quit, people that have had, success and launching their businesses across the world. They want out, but they don't sort of want to leave people in the lurch. People that have been at it for 6 years but are tired, and people that kind of, again, this perception or this thought that they need to grind, but they don't know how to find their way back to focus. So again, it's this idea as well that it's sort of a bit of a marathon, not a sprint, but again as well that it's this kind of success as well, and the better you do, the more pressure builds, because the more, whether it's, investment returns you're trying to generate, the more employees you have to look after, the more customers you're trying to service. As all of these things scale up, and we know that startups kind of scale up at a extraordinary sort of rate, the higher the pressure builds. And again, I suppose this is the point I was just making in terms of, founders and entrepreneurs are always being stretched in these different directions. So again, this idea that it's a bad relationship, where you can kind of fix the small things, but, it's not great if you kind of, achieve all the success, but feel like you need to have this divorce, or that you need to step away to move on from your life. So a lot of it is just about trying to find balance and work out who's there and what tools you need to support and help find that. So again, just this idea that you're in between a rock and a hard place, and being stretched in multiple directions, and having to kind of help cater to and service sort of different stakeholders and audiences. And then actually putting some figures to it. I think this is from stress.org. Dan can correct me in a second if I was wrong, but in the US alone, it's estimated that $300 billion is lost in burnout. So through, missed days and slowdowns in productivity and all of those sorts of things. So there's, a big economic argument to make as well about making sure that, we're all looking after our well-being in general. So I will hand over to Dan now. If you want to take control, you can.
All right. Thank you. So, some of what Gareth and maybe a lot of what Gareth has just described may be familiar to it, but it's important familiar to you for those of you in the startup space. But it's useful painting that context and thinking about the overall economic impact. There was some research actually done by Medibank a couple of years ago that estimated the equivalent level of impact of stress and burnout in Australia was between 10 and 14 billion. So there's really a sense of, this is coming at a huge cost to our society. And so why does this really matter to us in Australia right now? Well, over the last 30 years, Australia's been comfortably growing, and kind of what got us here won't get us to the next stage, what we need to get to. So it's almost a risk if we keep doing what we've been doing and don't start to think about creating a smarter, more sophisticated ecosystem to support these businesses. So when you consider the industrial complexity of Australia, this is the HBR index, Australia is a bit of a paradox because it's the 8th richest nation, but has the export profile of Angola. Not only that, we've actually dropped 5 places in the last 10 years. So for those of you who can't see the small details, the green areas are the complex, high complex parts of our economy, and the lighter colours are the less complex. But when you compare that with Japan, who are the leaders and they're first, you can see on that index how much more sophisticated their ecosystem is, not only the industrial ecosystem, but therefore the startup ecosystem. So they can support more complexity and are more resilient and able to cope as they move forward. So this is something that's really important for Australia, especially having just had the year that we've had. And our next crop of startups is really vital to continuing the prosperity that we've had because it offers opportunities to develop and to grow and enrich our society. So we know entrepreneurs create the status quo and solve complex, wicked problems. And, there's a shift in here that we're starting to think about, thinking of startups almost as a crop, shift from the idea of instant returns to something to be nurtured over time. So thinking about it in terms of industrial complexity, thinking about it as a crop, something you can invest in, something that we can harvest, stops this kind of spike that's causing so much pressure. Because there's a new wave coming. We've got climate change issues that aren't going away. That conversation's getting louder and louder. This lockdown over the last year has really kind of challenged some of the existing systems and wealth inequity and global reliance on supply chains and resources and finances. All of that has been kind of reappraised. The idea of security, everything from biotech to manufacturing, suddenly homegrown innovation became much more important as borders closed and the planes stopped flying. But we're conscious that making the most of these opportunities can't be done alone. As Gareth said, the work that we've done with startups and big brands and ecosystems, we understand that to succeed, startups need the support of ecosystems, which is really what triggered this talk today. We need to make sure that the right people and resources are in place to support that, to make everything work so they can help lead us to a brighter tomorrow. You today can help us lead to a brighter tomorrow. And we see this as designing a national advantage, having looked at the complexity, having looked at what we've been through and what's coming. To advance our innovation maturity, ensuring that founders can thrive is therefore a strategic imperative for Australia. Because the founder's value rests in this ability to lead their business. Some research from KPMG was saying very clearly this determines the fate of a startup, right? Their ability to lead their business. And when you hear the amount of stress as Gareth has just described and the cost to our society, it's very clear that we need to change what we've been doing. This is all about making high quality decisions. And again, this research was showing us that a founder's personal well-being, their physical and mental health, informs not only the quality of the decisions, but how they lead, from how they communicate to who and how they hire, how they foster and build a culture necessary for the startup to succeed. And as Gareth was saying, that pressure can build over time. Often when people get that funding, that's when the real pressure starts, because the expectation is you can hire and you can scale. And these are all skills that initial founders may not have and need to quickly acquire under the time pressure and returns pressure. So the nice quote from Simon Sinek, He said, failure we can do alone, but success always takes help. And I guess what you're starting to see here is looking at the context, looking at the impact on the nation, and then thinking about how we start to shift it. A lot of the work that Gareth and I are doing are sort of kind of system thinking, thinking about behaviour change. This is really thinking holistically about what it would take to change the nation. So, an action plan. What can founders and VCs do? We're very conscious that there's a duality in here. Just asking founders to make time to take care of themselves or providing more access to care won't necessarily shift the needle. We need an action plan to make this work. And we need to shift our behaviour, and perhaps it's the media behaviour, away from an obsession with unicorns. This kind of, by their very nature, unicorns are rare, and we need to think about playing a longer game. We need to think about, harvesting, supporting, nourishing, enriching, and thinking about what that can give us over time. So when we think about this, and to Gareth's point about the points that we're stepping through, when we think about, okay, let's first of all understand and value well-being. Hopefully you can see the economic impact and the national impact. So it's like, okay, if we want to get VCs to value this, right, we want them to think about and consider and agree with that the investing in a founder wellness is an investment in their investment, right? It doesn't just stop when they hand the money over. Obviously they're engaged in the business, but it's all about how can you support the founder holistically. So we're proposing a shift from venture capital to venture health. So just reframing this allows us to then start to think about shifting the conversation, shifting the behaviours, shifting the permissions and the systems that we wrap around that. So it's less about return and more about what's the health of the organisation. And that by health is multidimensional, as you'll see. Because we're thinking about health not just in terms of growth. There was a great quote, and they said, growth without purpose is a bit like cancer. So, that's the only time that it's kind of visible without something happening that's worthwhile. So we want to move from value extraction mode to value creation mode, but playing this longer game. We want to shift the emphasis from accelerated growth to sustained growth, from accepting a burn rate for cash and for humans, let's be honest, and avoiding burnout through designing these support systems and backup protocols. What's in place to support this? And that's how we build resilience, right? It's through those processes. And then on the founders' side, for founders, making it very clear that a focus on their well-being isn't selfish because it pays dividends for their business, their teams, their partners, and their whole lives, right? So this is the shift. It's about permission, making space, making it happen. There's a really interesting quote from Eric Wilson over at Ginger. He said, sometimes you just don't really know what you're doing. Accepting that mindset is, I think, incredibly important to being viable under this kind of pressure. And that's what we're talking about, is how do you sustain viability under that constant pressure? It's okay to show vulnerability, right? We're shifting the conversation from the sort of founder that knows it all, creating a unicorn, to a founder that's vulnerable and has a team to say, I don't know, I have no idea if this is going to work. The ability not to have to pretend, right? Don't always have the answers is very powerful for an entrepreneur's mindset. So we're shifting how we're kind of talking about entrepreneurs and the mindset and our expectations, in a sense, around that. Enabling them to stay focused and work with the team and be vulnerable is incredibly important. Okay, so that's great. So how are we going to make this work? Well, as Gareth said, value mindset number one, this is a marathon, not a sprint, right? This is less a rush to an IPO, a breathless rush to an IPO, and more planting the seeds of tomorrow. That's part of why we framed it in a national context and a global context, because it's all about what's coming down the track. It's all about what are we doing for tomorrow. Okay, so we're moving from spontaneous and short-term geniuses, getting rid of those mindsets and the risk of fly-by-night associations that come with startups, this sense of it's winning the lottery if you get it right. We're resetting expectations, especially for investors, the talent, and corporates. And some of the research we were doing, there was a nice quote that said, there's a real fear around high-growth businesses that you have to challenge your values. This is back to the assumption that you have to compromise your values, your health, your well-being, all of that in this. But if we're playing a longer game, then we get a chance to say, you know what, we don't have to do that. We can frame it in a different way. So the shift is to smart and longer term, better conveying the considered and responsible side of startups. They're not all overnight successes, but there's a team of smart people and organizations committed to the journey. again, one of the lovely quotes from our research was that everyone could probably do with a dose of patience. And when you think about it, in terms of the long-term impact and scale, patience is valuable. Because this is all about moving to a sense of we, not I. Right? This is less the chosen few, but more the A team as we're seeing it. Because focusing only on those at the very top and getting caught up in the startup fandom paints a kind of hollow picture of the real stories, right? So, as you'll know, founders are often driven by a purpose and have a very clear vision for what they want to achieve in that space. The fandom that comes later sort of devalues that in a sense. And we need to foster an entrepreneurial mindset rather than putting entrepreneurs on a pedal. So it's like, how can we build that in to everyone that's engaged in that space? Because this is all about delivering broad-based impact. So we've moved from individual heroes to broad-based impact from the team, opening up the conversation, illustrating the tight team needed to create material impact on communities at home and abroad, to the people they employ, the customers who benefit, the lives that are changed. So again, instead of that focus on the founders alone, we need to work on the first 100. And I guess for those founders watching, it's that sense of like opening up that remit and not taking all that pressure on themselves. Those in that core 100, that believe in the venture, people would describe themselves as being part of the first 100 of an organization and still being really passionate about bringing that to life. So, conscious that thinking holistically, we'd also need to start celebrating the VC or the VH support that made that possible. Not just the money, but the progressive VCs that allowed space for that recharging. So we imagine a high-performing index of well teams, sort of a venture health index, not the toxic cultures that have made headlines around like Uber or WeWork, but actually thinking about how do you create a sustainable high-performance index and a high-performance set of teams. And, to make this work, you have to live it every day. Later on, we'll show you some experience principles that kind of embed that in the day-to-day decision-making. This is really about your vision and your values adding up to well-being and baking it in from day one so that the exchange is that when you get investments and you grow, you do it in a way that's healthy. It's healthy for your team. You're not burning your people out. You do it in a way that's, viable over time. So this is just an indicative list of the content that might be part of a program to deliver this, a set of practices designed to boost performance and leadership skills while elevating the value of time invested in well-being. Conscious that if we're asking people to learn new skills, they've already got a lot going on, so we need to make space and underpin that with permission for downtime. So, understanding communication styles, theirs and the others around them, and the leadership bias, improving soft skills and the value of culture and human capital. As I said, often people don't come into the space with those skills. Learning how to hire the right talent to transform the startup helps take the load off. Understanding tools and skills to build those high-performing teams. Connecting with other founders is crucial because you get that sense of how they've helped scale their organizations or are scaling. So that lack of isolation is important, I think. Working on the business, obviously, rather than in it, but realignment with the why constantly. And looking to identify blind spots and beliefs around what success is. These pieces that we've described about, not accepting the burnout rate and not accepting that you have to sacrifice yourself to achieve that. Ultimately, it has to be underpinned by permission for that downtime exercise and almost describing it as health investment supported by the team around you and the funding people. So this is a reminder really that for those VCs, investing in founder wellness really is an investment in their investment. So imagine a world where we've brought all of this together, right? We've shifted permissions, we've shifted expectations, we've shifted mindsets, skill sets, tool sets, behaviors, and even the stories that we tell about that. So I keep doing that because it's holistic, but this is really an opportunity for this world where founders investment from those who support their well-being, where well-being becomes actually a competitive advantage over time. For the VCs, for the founders, it's a virtuous circle, but also for Australia, our society, and perhaps even further abroad, we start to really start to bring that potential to life. And that shift in focus, right? Obviously, the VCs are connected to the founders. founders are connected to the employees, business, and customers. But if we can really focus on those VCs supporting the founders while the founder works on the business, takes care of the employees, the rest will take care of itself. That will allow them to deliver value to the customer without killing themselves in the process. So we envisioned a manifesto for VCs. We invest in founders, so expect them to take self-care seriously. We create personalized, effective hacks and systems with our founders to help them balance their well-being with high performance. We ensure founders have the time, resources, and support they need to ensure self-care and high performance. We're conscious self-care and high performance might mean different things to different people, but that's why it has to be personalized and tailored. So that's a summary of how we've stepped through, first of all, valuing well-being. What's the importance of well-being? What's that value mindset, right? How do we start to bring that together? How do we start to value the team, and how do we start to value it every day? And so a lot of the work that we do with brands and organizations is around, we create experience principles, right? So this is indicative experience principles for what we're calling a venture health program. So this brings to life the brand purpose, and in this instance, we've described it around building resilience and high performance into our startups by supporting holistic founder health. How that then starts to map out is like, how are people behaving? These frameworks give you an agreed space, an agreed way of behaving over time. So in terms of values, they're empathetic, enduring, engaging, and enabling. So these indicatively start to demonstrate how people behave, and we'll unpack those a little bit further. In terms of those experience principles, how do we deliver that experience, right? When we say we're empathetic, that's really about listening to you, creating that dialogue. In terms of enduring, we're here to play the long game together. In terms of engaging, we'll push you to greater heights, right? We'll enable all of those things to elevate and help you achieve more possibly than you thought you could, because we want to ensure considered action. So all of that is considered. And then moving into the brand experience promise, what's the one thing that we're promising to fulfill in this way? We invest in our founders both financially and emotionally so they can balance their individual well-being with high quality performance to achieve sustained excellence. So the design, in this instance, it's from founders and the startup team, the entrepreneurs. What do we want them to feel? We want them to feel understood, right? It's crucial. And we want them to feel safe. So Google talk a lot about, psychological safety being crucial to innovation. If you feel safe, then you build safe teams around you. The organization is more resilient, more innovative, and it's empowered, right? This combination starts to really drive action in a positive and powerful way. And ultimately, all of these things brought together by shifting those permissions, behaviors, those mindsets, those tools can create that real sense of achievement. And perhaps it's not a 3-year cycle or a giant spike, but perhaps it's one that's stretched out over time, but it's real meaningful achievement that contributes, as Gareth was saying, to a greater dimensionality to our society. So if anybody is interested, if this has provoked any thoughts with people, we'll jump to some questions in a second. But, if you wanted to explore and continue this conversation, by all means, feel free to, as Gareth said, reach out and get in touch. We feel there's a real opportunity in this space. And our purpose as an organisation, for Principles, is to really make your brand a force for positive change. So as I said, we work with sort of huge international companies, local companies, startups across medtech, adtech, a whole range of organisations of all scale, but we help them make their brand a force for positive change.